This week, we would ask the question, where is your heart? This week's portion is all about the tithe, bringing it in, eating it before Adonai. And what do you do if you're too far away? Remember the Levite, the alien, the widow, and the orphan. We have some basic reminders about the tithe, which is a good thing. Walking out our faith in a very tangible way is very important. If you'll pardon me, faith without hands and feet is, well, lame, pun intended. We need to practice our faith, even with our tithe. But this raises a more important question. Before we go there, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we again thank you that we can look into your word, that we can consider those things that you would say to us. We ask, Father, that you would help us to understand and be attentive, that you would make clear in our understanding what is good and right in your sight, that we might walk accordingly. We ask, Father, in Yeshua's name. Amen. So, tithing our income, our increase, the increase of our wealth, is important, but it should bring to our thoughts the whole of financial stewardship and the idea of our treasure. One of Messiah's teachings about finances ends like this. In Matthew 6:21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Interesting way to phrase it. If we look at the underlying language in Hebrew, the word for treasure is otsar. It comes from a root atzar, which has the concept of storing up or laying up, even hoarding. So the Hebrew words are otsar, the treasure, a store, a treasury, a storehouse, and it comes from atzar, which is the idea of laying up or storing up, maybe safeguarding, different things along that line. So the word otsar, the treasure, is used in the verse that we're just going to look at here in Deuteronomy 28:12 about the blessings from Adonai. It's not something that's hoarded. God doesn't hoard. But it is a valuable resource that is kept for a special purpose. So our word otsar, the treasure, in Deuteronomy 28:12, the Lord will open for you his good storehouse, his tov otsar, the good storehouse, the heavens, to give rain to your land in its season, and to bless all the work of your hands. And you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. The otsar, the treasure, the storehouse, is a place that's safeguarded and kept for a special use. Strongly suggested in this verse is the idea of the treasure. That which is stored is that which is of great value to the one storing. It's not, you don't just store up things that are of no value. You store up those things which have value. A person stores, protects, keeps in safety that which has real value to them. Now, it doesn't matter if others value the treasure or not. The treasure is a treasure to the one who stores it up. Okay, so it's an otsar, a treasure that we would hold, something that we would desire to keep and store up and protect and keep safe. So if that's the idea of the word treasure, what is the idea of the heart that Messiah would co-locate with the treasure? Where your treasure is, there will your heart be. The underlying language in Greek and then Hebrew. In Greek it's kardia, I think. And better, because Greek is just sort of a pass-through for us from the Hebrew understanding, is the word lev or levav. And they're pretty much, lev and levav are pretty much interchangeable. And they both come from a Hebrew root word, lavav, which, as you see on the screen, is an unused root, and it means the idea of probably, it means to be hollow, probably the idea of to be fat or smooth, and it refers to the smooth muscles of the heart, perhaps the hollow form of the heart as it's a pump. And there may be more in that, but we'll leave that for now. The heart, though, has some very significant meanings. So looking through the various uses of lev and levav, the heart, we get the idea that the heart seems the core of our psyche, our mind, will, and the thoughts of emotion. So I'd like to look at a few verses where this is used so that we can get a feel, because we fall into the trap of the heart being this romantic kind of ushy-gushy kind of thing. What we need to do when we're looking at a heart in the scriptures, because it's going to come up later as very important, we need to look and see how the scriptures, how God uses and what he thinks of the idea of the heart. I think we're going to come to the end of it, that it is our mind, will, and emotions, or the thoughts of our emotion. So, in we go. Classically, God explains the rationale for the flood, the will, the desires, and the thoughts of the heart. This is what he's looking at in Genesis 6:5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And he's speaking there of the intention and the thoughts of the heart. It's not a romantic thing. The heart is where our mind, our will, our desires, our emotions, the thoughts of our emotions, where those are centered. Abraham, the picture, you can see the picture. He's thinking and speaking in his heart, which happens to be that God is listening to it. In Genesis 17:17, the promise has been given that Sarah would bear his heir. Abraham fell on his face. Well, okay, so the picture has him on his back. But he fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? The idea of humor, the idea of thinking about it, of speaking in his heart. This is not just a romantic gushy-gushy. This is serious mental work that's going on. And the scriptures describe it as our heart. The Philistine king Avimelech, or Avimelech, in a dream that he has and encounters with God, declares in Genesis 25, did he not say to me, did he not himself say to me, she is my sister, and she herself said, he is my brother? In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands I have done this. Avimelech is appealing to the understanding that the heart is a place where our conduct is thought through, where our intentions are presented. And he says in the integrity of his heart. Again, the mind, the will, the thoughts of our emotions, our desires. It's all bound up in, and not just Abraham, but Avimelech, a king of the Philistines. Abraham's servant, Eliezer, is on a mission. He's commissioned to go back to the people in Padan Aram, in Haran, and find a bride for Yitzchak. And he says in Genesis 24:45, before I finished speaking in my heart. Well, now he's praying. Before the speaking in his heart is he's praying to God. He is lifting up his desires, his duties, his thoughts, his hopes, and he is speaking in his heart. And he says, before I finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder and went down to the spring and drew, and I said to her, please let me drink. He is relating the story, but what's important for us is prayer. Those thoughts and desires, perhaps even beyond words, are presented as coming in his heart. Esau and Yaakov, not too happy of brothers with one another. Esau's planning and thinking in his mind, and that planning and thinking in his mind is presented as he said to himself, he said in his heart, his lev, in Genesis 27:41. So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, it says, he said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. His anger, yes, but his desires, his plans, his hopes, these are all said in his heart. They are things that he thinks. The heart, the mind, the will, the emotion, all of that. This is the heart. Classically, again, the concept of Pharaoh, who is holding on to God's people, and his heart, his will, the strength of his will. It says that God said that he will harden his heart. At least in this verse. Other places, Pharaoh gets to harden his own heart. But to strengthen his resolve, that's what it means to harden his heart. So Exodus 4:21. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders which I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart. I will strengthen his resolve, his will. I will make his will strong, so that he will not let the people go. He will not send them out. This is the heart. This is the heart that we're talking about, not the heart of today. But looking at these few verses, and there are many, but these few, we get the idea that the heart seems to be the core of our psyche, our mind, will, and the thoughts of our emotion. So for us to get a handle on Messiah's statement about where your treasure is, there will your heart be, I think we need to get a digression into logic. And I apologize, this is not going to be hard. Just hopefully we'll be able to go through this and it'll make some sense. So, a simple syllogism. It's a statement that starts with a condition and ends in a consequence. It's an if then this, if this then this statement. And it's true. We define the syllogism as that which is true. So let's take a simple example. And I don't mean to be in any way grotesque here. So we'll take this lightly. The conditional statement of the syllogism is, if I jump off a building, then I will die. And it's true. I mean, we just take it. We assume that the condition is true. It just is. And then we explore things that are logically true. If this is true, what else is true, or what else is false? And this is a logical evaluation. So there is a converse, where you take the condition and put that, the consequence and put that in front, make it the condition, and you take the condition and make it the consequence. It looks like this, the converse. If I die, then I jumped off a building. Well, that's false. I mean, there's a lot of ways to die, not just jumping off a building. I mean, you could get run over by a car, you could just die of old age. Our young lady there sitting at her birthday party. But if you died, it's not true that you necessarily jumped off a building. And then the inverse. If I don't jump off a building, remember, if I do jump off a building, I'll die. It says if I don't jump off a building, then I won't die. Well, that's not true. You can die from a whole bunch of things, not just jumping off a building. I mean, if you just stayed on the ground the rest of your life is still going to come to an end some way or another. So if I don't jump off a building, then I won't die. That's false. That's the inverse. But there is one twisting of this conditional, this syllogism that we started with, and that's the contrapositive. Big word, sorry about that. It's just what they use. If I don't die, then I didn't jump off a building. So if I'm still alive, if I am still alive, I did not jump off a building. Don't look at that picture for too long. I looked at it and I got kind of woozy and I'm sitting in a chair. But if I'm still alive, I didn't jump off a building. And that's true, because if I did jump, I'd be dead. That's what we started with. If I jump off a building, I'll die. So the contrapositive is also true. The conditional is true by definition. The converse is false. The inverse is false. Contrapositive is true. Okay, those four, and it works that way. So let's take Messiah's statement, and this is kind of a classical thing that you do in logic, and we're going to transform it from being the statement like he made, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also, and we're going to make it into a conditional. It's the same understanding. Basically, if your treasure is in something, where your treasure is, then your heart will be there also. So if this condition, then this consequence. Now, if that is a true statement, and we're assuming that Messiah would tell us truth, I mean, that's just a given, right? Then if we looked at the converse, if that's true, if we look at the converse, which we know by definition, we looked at the example earlier, it's false. If your heart is in something, the converse, then your treasure will be there also. That, by definition, and by what we saw, is false. Okay? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be, is a true statement. If your heart is in something, then your treasure will be there also, is false. Okay, so that's going to have some real interesting observations for us. So, it's not true that our heart, the mind, will, and emotional thought, drives us. It is not the heart that does that. That's the false part. What's true is it is the treasure that drives us. Where our treasure is, there will our heart be. And this place of where the treasure is the place that our heart will migrate to. It's not a maybe it will, maybe it won't. What Messiah observed and stated as truth is where the treasure is, there the heart will be. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to try and figure it out or make it work. It just is. Simple and easy. Where the treasure is, there the heart will be. And that's a real interesting insight for us into our human behavior. So what else does this tell us? If we want to test and see where our heart, our mind, will, and our emotional thought is, where our commitment is, where our loyalty is set, then we don't look to where we think our heart is, whatever we think our heart is. That's not where we look. It seems like we should be able to do that. Like, well, I want to test where my heart is, so I'm just going to look at where my heart is. But that's not what Messiah said. He said the only true test to check is to look at the treasure. Because where the treasure is kept and stored and how it is spent, that's the test. That's where our heart will be. It is not to look at the heart to find out where it is, because we can be deceived. But if we know where our treasure is, then we'll know where the heart is. So what are some of the things, if we're going to try and get a grasp on what Messiah is telling us, what are some of the things that can be a treasure for us that we would want to test? If we especially treasure our time, then our test is where do we spend our time? Or worse, do we hoard our time? Perhaps all our time is what we call me time. It's for me. I can do whatever I want. I don't want somebody taking up my time. If our time is very valuable to us, if it is a treasure to us, then that is a really good place to test where our heart is going to be. How about money? If our money is our treasure, how do we spend it? Or what do we spend it on? Or maybe even how do we hoard our money? If our money is our treasure, because Messiah was kind of slick about this. He didn't say where your money is. He said where your treasure is. That which you store up. Could be time, could be money. What about our energy, our mental, emotional, spiritual? How do we spend a treasure of our energy? Do we reserve it for ourselves? Do we spend it on those things we want? Or do we let it be available for God to use wherever and however He wants? How do we, if our energy is our treasure, how do we store it, save it, or how do we spend it? What about our reputation. Is our reputation our treasure? If it's our treasure, how do we protect it and keep it and safeguard it? Or how do we let our reputation be used? And perhaps by whom? If our reputation is our treasure. What about our relationships? If our relationships are our treasure, then how do we protect and keep and safeguard those relationships? How do we let perhaps our relationships control our conduct? Do we let them push us in directions and do things that perhaps may not be appropriate? Just to keep those relationships, just to make sure everybody's happy. Whatever it is that you store up, that you save, that you keep, and not all of these are going to be your treasures. Some of these are irrelevant to you. But there is something that you have that is a special treasure that you save and keep and even hoard. And you're going to have to be a little honest with you, maybe even brutally honest with yourself about what it is that you secretly store up and hoard as your treasure. So, knowing what our treasure is, we have an effective test now for that treasure, right? That which we store up. Because that's what the idea of treasure is. That which you store up and you safeguard and you keep. Or perhaps how you spend. But knowing what our treasure is, then we can tell where our heart, the mind, will, and our emotional thought is centered. Because it's where our treasure is. Knowing what our treasure is and where it is, that is where our heart is going to be. Now, that's really important because God said 6 times in the Torah, all of them in Deuteronomy, that you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart. Deuteronomy 6:5, 10:12, 11:13, 13:3, and 36. Do you love God with all your heart? Well, how do we know? Because the heart is not the thing that we can check, right? It's our treasure. The treasure tells us where the heart is. God says you love him with all your heart. Is your heart there? We have this test, so we now have a treasure test that we can use. The thing of it is, what if our treasure test shows that something else is actually ahead of God? What if God is not that which we love and treasure with our whole heart? What can we do about it? I think that Messiah's teaching, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also includes an answer to this problem. What can we do? Not only does he provide us this treasure test that we were talking about earlier, where what is your treasure, and then where your treasure is, there your heart will be, but within that truth of where your treasure is, there your heart will be, there is the truth of that test, there is an opening for us to the solution of perhaps having a misaligned heart. If our mind, our will, our emotional thought, those things which are important to us, if our heart isn't with God, how do we get it aligned? So since our treasure is the driver, remember we had that slide earlier, the treasure that drives where our heart is going to be. If we invest our treasure in something, in this case God, our heart will eventually be drawn to where we have invested our treasure. Remember, that's what Messiah said. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. To move our heart, that we're supposed to love God with, our mind, will, and our emotional thought to where it needs to be, loving God, we need to invest or spend our treasure on God. So we need to understand what it is that God is doing. So what is God doing? And to be involved in that. We want to be involved in what God is doing. That's what Messiah said. He saw what his Father was doing and he did that. We need to be that involved. We need to understand also what it is that God desires us to be doing within that work that he is doing. We don't just go in and say, well, I see that God is doing this, so I am going to do this. We see what he's doing and then we wait and say, what do you want me to do? We need to make it true that whatever his desire is, whatever he is doing and whatever he desires us to do, his desire is our command. So if we know that, then, if we know what he's doing, what he desires us to do, then we invest all our treasure. Forget about the heart for a minute. We invest our treasure in that work. So there are a couple of stories I'd like to relate about treasures and how they're handled. Now, these are going to be real easy because these are finances. Finances is easy to see. Reputations, relationships, time, all the other things we talked about earlier as examples. And those are just examples. Those are difficult, but finances, that's a really easy one to see because, treasure, everybody thinks of financial treasure. So I'd like to look at two stories about how treasure is held onto or not, and how that affects a love for God, a treasure in our heart. And then there's a closing story. So first, this is from Matthew. It's recorded in three of the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels: Matthew 19:16-29, Mark 10:17-30, and Luke 18:18-30. There was a rich young man, and he treasured his wealth. We know that because he had great wealth, and it was important to him. But he knew that his love for God was not complete. And so he goes to Messiah, the traveling rabbi, comes into town, and the rich young man comes up to him and says, "So, what do I need to do to have eternal life?" And Messiah told, after he'd done the checklist of you've been doing all the right things, he sees that in his heart, Messiah sees that in his heart there is this treasure that has kept his heart from following God. And so this young man had a treasure of his wealth. Messiah told him to invest all his wealth, that is his treasure, in the poor. Go and sell all you have and give to the poor. And then you will have treasure with God, because taking care of the poor is what God does. And then he says, "Follow me." Says that rich young man kept his treasure. He didn't invest it in the work that God was doing. He didn't take care of the poor. He held on to the treasure of wealth, and he lost his love for God. His heart did not move to loving God because he held on to his treasure. He did not move the treasure where it needed to go so his heart could follow. The second story I'd like to relate is about a wee little man. This is from Luke 19:1. If you know the song, you already know the song, right? Luke 19:1-10. Zacchaeus, a local tax collector. He also had a treasure in money and in a reputation. I mean, he was important. He was the tax collector. He didn't like it that people made fun of him, but he was a little guy, so he couldn't do anything about it. His money and his reputation were important. But Messiah was coming. And something in Zacchaeus stirred. And he wanted to see Messiah. He wanted to hear him. And as Messiah passes by, where Zacchaeus has climbed up in the tree, he's such a little guy, he can't even see Messiah, but he's up in the tree. Messiah comes by and says, "Zacchaeus, come down. Hurry, hurry, come down, for I must eat in your house today." That's all he had to say. That is absolutely all of it. As soon as Messiah appeared and said hello, Zacchaeus repented. I mean, he couldn't repent fast enough. And he said, "If I have stolen anything, I'm going to return it. I don't care about my reputation. I don't care about the treasure of wealth. I'm going to return it. And if I've wronged anyone, not just stolen, if I've wronged anyone, I'm going to invest in them by giving them back. I'm going to tell them that I was wrong. I'm going to invest in them. I'm going to do everything that the Torah says." He was moving his treasure into the work that God did. And when he moved his treasure into what God was doing, Messiah's response was that salvation has come to this house. Zacchaeus moved his treasure from being his wealth to being invested in what God was doing. And his heart went along, and salvation came to his house. The love of God flourished because he loved God with his whole heart. So those are two passages from the scripture. There's another story that's it's very famous. It's a very famous story, and you may already know it. So hopefully I will relate it properly. It is often seen about a story of as a story about gratitude and generosity. But if we're thinking in terms of where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That teaching of Messiah, that truth, that kind of a test and evaluation and moving our heart to where it needs to be by moving our treasure. If we can keep that in mind, I think we're going to see that that is also deeply embedded in this story. The story is traditionally called The Rusty Penny. It's related here by Tuvia Bolton. He's a Rosh Yeshiva in Israel. And this is what he relates. I'm going to basically just read it for you. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, from the 18th century, 1745 to 1812, he was the founder of Chabad Hasidism, was raising money to ransom Jewish prisoners. He went first to a city that was famous for its miser. It seems that this stingy man, despite his considerable wealth, was loath to share his blessings, no matter how worthy or urgent the cause. Rabbis and beggars alike avoided his home. Anyone who did unwittingly end up on his doorstep was offered a single rusty copper coin, which even the most desperate pauper would promptly refuse. When Rabbi Zalman arrived in the town, the elders of the community graciously received him. But when he announced that he wanted to visit the house of the miser and wanted 2 rabbis to accompany him, he was met with serious resistance. The Rebbe was adamant, however, and they finally acquiesced and gave him the escort he requested. The next afternoon, the 3 of them were standing in front of the miser's mansion. Before knocking on the door, the Rebbe turned to his companions and requested that they not utter a word, no matter what they see or hear. Several moments later, they were sitting in the luxurious front room, and the owner was returning from his safe with a small velvet money pouch. "Yes," said the rich man, "a touching story indeed. Widows and orphans in captivity. Ah, the suffering of the Jewish people. When will it end? Here, Rabbi, take my humble donation." To the miser's surprise, the Rebbe seemed pleased by the gift. He was actually smiling at him warmly as he put the coin in his pocket and said, "Thank you, Mr. Solomons. May God bless and protect you always." The Rebbe then proceeded to write him a receipt, adding all sorts of blessings in a most beautiful script. "Thank you again, my friend," said the Rebbe as he stood and warmly shook the man's hand, looking him deeply in the eyes with admiration. "And now," he added, turning to his 2 companions, "we must be on our way. We have a lot of collecting to do tonight." As the 3 rabbis walked to the door, the Rebbe turned and bade his host yet another warm farewell. "You should have thrown it back in his face," hissed one of the rabbis after they heard the door close behind them. "Don't turn around. Don't say a word," whispered the Rebbe as they walked down the path to the front gate. Suddenly, they heard the door opening behind them, and the miser calling, "Rabbis, rabbis, please come back for a minute. Hello, hello, please. I must speak to you. Please, please, come back in." In a few minutes, they were again sitting in the warm plush drawing room. But this time, the rich man was pacing back and forth restlessly. He stopped for an instant, turned to the Rebbe. "Exactly how much money do you need to ransom these prisoners?" "About 5,000 rubles, the Rebbe replied. "Well, here is 1,000. I have decided to give 1,000 rubles. You may count it if you want," said the miser as he took a lightly bound stack of bills from his jacket pocket and laid it on the table. The other rabbis were astounded. They stared at the money and were even afraid to look up at the miser lest he change his mind. But the Rebbe again shook Mr. Solomon's hand, warmly thanking him, and wrote him a beautiful receipt, replete with blessings and praises, exactly like the first time. "That was a miracle," whispered one of the rabbis to the Rebbe as they left the house and were again walking toward the gate. Once more the Rebbe signaled to him to be still. Suddenly the door to the house again opened behind them. "Rabbis, please, I've changed my mind. Please, come in once more. I want to speak with you," Mr. Solomon called out. They entered the house for the third time, as the miser turned to them and said, "I have decided to give the entire sum needed for the ransom. Here it is. Please count it to see that I have not made a mistake." "What is the meaning of this?" wondered the Rebbe's astonished companions after they had left the rich man's home for the third time that evening. "How did you get that notorious miser to give you 5,000 rubles?" "That man is no miser," said Rabbi Zalman. "No Jewish soul truly is. But how could he desire to give if he never in his life experienced the joy of giving? Everyone to whom he gave that rusty penny of his threw it back in his face." That's the end of the story. I think we can see that each time the miser invested his treasure in the work that God was doing, his heart moved. First just one copper coin, then 1,000 rubles, then the entire amount. We, if our heart is not in the right place, don't try and move your heart. Invest. Invest in what God is doing. Invest the treasure that you have in what God is doing. Shabbat Shalom.